Ladies and gentlemen, Season 7 is almost here. Man, I can't believe I was somehow able to make all 4 of these lists just in time before Season 7 came along. But before we can move on to next season, we must finish up with Season 6. Season 6 feels a bit of a step backwards from Season 5, but that's only because Season 5 was just so fantastic that trying to improve on it would be very difficult. Season 6 feels more akin to Season 2 in terms of overall quality, maybe even a little better, but Season 6 also is a far cry from the first 2 seasons, given how much has improved in research, animation, and just overall quality. But I'm wasting my time, and Vlaire only allows for 45-minute uploads without premium, so let's get right into this. This is Wolf's Top 16, Season 6, Death Battle Episodes. I will admit, Season 6 didn't have as bad an overall start as previous seasons, like Season 4, but it got off to a very slow start. How slow? Well, of the first 4 episodes, 3 of them are at the very bottom, and they're the episodes I hated this season. And honestly, the worst one really is the one that felt like it was made solely to take advantage of YouTube's algorithm.
What's the matter? Can't keep up?
This was just a sad display. Like, the idea has merit. I've heard people say that the matchup itself is dumb, but I don't think so. Besides the name, both Captain Marvel and Shazam have some good similarities, even if they aren't always obvious. Like how the two basically inherited their superpowers, with Carol getting them from Marvel and Billy getting them from the Wizard, and they even inherited their names now that Billy's known as Shazam. Point is, the matchup's a pretty good, or at least decent idea. But man, did it seem like nobody who worked on this, save for Genevieve, who was the writer of this episode, and the research team, seemed to care. I mean, the voice acting's decent, and I can't really blame them for trying, even if certain delivery is pretty bad. But honestly, the animation is the worst part about this episode. I mean, it's already a rather dull episode, but it at least felt like it was starting to pick up. And then it slammed into a brick wall. The finishing blow just feels so anticlimactic. It's like they couldn't figure out how to end the fight, so they just had Billy punch Carol really hard. Plus, the hand-drawn animation just feels like a massive step backwards, to the point that it looks like it came from Season 4. The music's decent, I guess. I like how it takes inspiration from the Avengers theme and the Justice League Unlimited theme. Really, this one's just absolutely bland and forgettable. I was actually debating which episode would be at the bottom, this one or Captain Marvel vs. Shazam, and it took until the very last minute before I finally made a decision.
I can't survive anything.
Nice theory. Let's test it. До свидания.
Really, this episode felt like it had the opposite problem of Carol versus Billy. Whereas that episode, it felt like Genevieve was the only one of the people who cared about it besides the research team. This time, it felt like the writers, Thak and Ben, didn't care that much and were the only ones not to. The writing is just boring, with no jokes that were very interesting, and with the entire episode just feeling like it was trying to put me to sleep. Plus, it was such an obvious stomp that any hope that this episode had died the moment it was announced. I'll give it credit, it did somewhat improve thanks to the animation, but only slightly. Heck, even the animation kinda screws up thanks to the writing because it seems to misinterpret Widowmaker's personality so badly that it felt like the person who made it didn't know her personality at all. To be fair to this episode, the voice actresses killed it. Jeannie Torado, just like Elsie Lovelock before her with Tracer, sounded so much like Chloe Hollings, Widowmaker's voice actress in Overwatch, that you'd be mistaken for thinking that they just got Chloe Hollings to do the voice acting. And Natalie Van Sistine was phenomenal as Black Widow, giving off a real sense that Black Widow's a badass secret agent as she's supposed to be. But really, the episode just didn't have enough for me to say it wasn't bad. And Widow's Kiss is another example of good backing track but boring song on its own, just like Devil of the Night. The reason I decided this one was better is that A, much like the bottom two of the Season 3 list, I really didn't expect much from this episode. Granted, this one at least tried to prove me wrong, unlike Deadpool vs. Pinkie Pie, but it is what it is. And B, it felt like this one had more effort put into it. Really, besides the verdict's accuracy, the episode reminds me a lot of Beast vs. Goliath, an episode that's kind of a stretch in concept and not very well written, but had an animation that tried, at least a little bit. But still, you know what they say about polishing a turd. I'm writing and uploading this video before Season 7's premiere is out. Please don't let this be 3 seasons in a row where the first episode is bad!
Well, seems we're evenly matched. Or maybe I've been saving another trick.
No! You control me? Impossible!
How about it, boys? Dinner's on the king tonight.
This episode, I will give it credit, at least tried. There's little pockets of good throughout the fight. For example, I like how Aquaman looks, sounds, and is written like he is in Batman the Brave and the Bold, which might be my favorite version of Aquaman ever. And the finisher is brutal, but no less awesome. But beyond that, this episode just doesn't work. The writing doesn't really hit that many good marks, with, I think, my favorite joke being Wiz stabbing Boomstick in the foot with the perfectly cut scream. But that's the only joke I can say made me laugh. Everything else was decent at best, and it rarely even got that high. The animation at least showed off their powers well, but then you have stuff like the rock monsters Namor summons. This just looks ugly and makes me wonder why they needed to add it. The music's alright, not exactly memorable, save with having the episode start with an instrumental version of All Star by Smash Mouth. I'll give this episode an A for effort, but that's about all I can give. So, Black Widow vs. Widowmaker had no expectations and ended up at least improving on them a little bit. Any way we can improve on that?
How strong are you?
Strong enough.
This episode feels like it was trying as hard as it could to be the antithesis of Yang vs. Tifa. It's a Ruby character going up against an RPG character who should absolutely mop the floor with her, and ultimately, it did just average. Granted, that's much better than what Yang vs. Tifa did, but it's still not great. First things first, it's another example of how the research has changed for the better when it comes to RPG characters, much like Sephiroth vs. Virgil. Mitsuru was given a ton of credit and scaling that she might not have really gotten back in the old days. Second is the animation. The choreography is absolutely beautiful and kind of feels like a graceful dance between the two fighters, which is kind of what they're meant to do with their battles. Also, the voice acting is great. Kara, as usual, does a great job reprising Weiss, but Corey does an amazing job with her performance as Mitsuru. But it was also rather slow too, so that is a problem. Still, it's better than what Yang vs. Tifa had. Also, I'm not too sold on Winter Sonata, really. I don't hate it, but I'm not really a fan of it. And honestly, Yang vs. Tifa does do one thing right: the writing. The writing wasn't exactly spectacular in this episode, save for Boomstick's science on explosions. That's probably the best part of this episode. And while Yang vs. Tifa's finisher was just anticlimactic, at least it was clear that the loser was dead. To a lot of people, it seemed like Weiss wasn't killed, and that the animators were told by the higher-ups not to have her actually die if she did end up losing. It It's not a bad episode, but it's still rather mediocre.
I'll put you to rest now. That's more like it. A fight fit for a demon.
Honestly, this episode should be lower than what it is. For one thing, I'm not exactly a fan of the characters. I didn't know anything about Hiei going into this episode except for that he was originally voiced by Chuck Huber in the dub, but I still wasn't sold on him once I did learn things about him. And Sasuke? I hate this guy. Like, I'm not a fan of Naruto to begin with, but I can't stand the trinity of Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura. Naruto I find is annoying, Sasuke is way too edgy, and I just find Sakura to be a bitch. So yeah, I was not looking forward to this fight at all, and when it was finally out, I still wasn't too sold on it. Fight's alright. Like, I expected it to be passable, and it was. The animation's not very good, but seeing the Dragon of the Darkness Flame battling against Susanoo was actually pretty well drawn. I do like the voice acting. Kyle Phillips does a great job voicing Sasuke, sounding like an odd mix between Yuri Lowenthal's voice form and Doug Erhold's voice for Squall Leonhardt. And Howard Wang sounds pretty good as Hiei. Actually, the audio elements overall were pretty good. Dangerous Gaze wasn't a song I was too keen on at first, but I'll happily give it a listen here and there. But the real reason this is higher than Weiss vs. Mitsuru is the finishing blow. I think I've said this before, multiple times in fact, but I'm a sucker for single-stroke duels. It's a cliche, sure, but it's a fun cliche that just looks awesome. Heck, that's part of the reason I love Ryu vs. Strider so much back in Season 2. If it weren't for that, this episode would be lower, and I might even consider putting it lower than Aquaman vs. Namor. But as it stands, it's a very okay episode with one hell of a finisher. Oddly enough, this episode kind of has the opposite problem.
This ends now!
At least I'm taller than you.
You left me no choice.
While I wasn't really a fan of either Sasuke or Hiei, I'm actually quite a fan of both Aang and Edward Elric. I never got to actually see Avatar past the first couple of episodes of Book 2 since I lost access to cable and didn't get it back until the show was off the air, but I did like it, and while I haven't seen much of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, I loved what I did see. So yeah, I should have been more psyched for this episode, but it just turned out to be okay. I know plenty of people wanted Ed to fight Joseph Joestar, but I think this fight was a good idea too. It's just how it was executed is all. First, I will say that I think the voice acting's pretty good. Emily Fajardo did a very good job voicing Aang, while Alejandro Saab did a pretty good job voicing Ed, even if he doesn't quite sound like you-know-who. And no, I am not mentioning his name because I don't want to bring in any controversy. The fight animation looks pretty good, with Ed's alchemy abilities being used great. But the episode just doesn't hit some of the right notes that it should. I find the episode to just be kind of boring at times, and I'm not too sold on elements of alchemy as a solo track. It's another example of great background song, but not a great song to listen to on its own. But it's honestly the writing that I think sells this episode, with plenty of good jokes that aren't just about the bad parts of the characters like Sasuke vs. Hiei had. It's an episode that's sort of on the border between okay and good, so I think putting it here is a good position for it. I wasn't initially sold on this fight when it was announced, but it did kind of prove me wrong.
You should pay more attention. Nobody beats me.
I wasn't expecting much from this episode given how little I knew about Mob Psycho 100 and One Punch Man, but this episode did better than I thought. It's not a great episode, but it is at least a good one. The voice acting is great with this one. What few lines Bo Brigdland has are great and feel perfectly in character with Mob's personality, while Jennifer Alex was great as Tatsumaki. I'll admit, her shouting can get grating, but hearing someone shout most of their lines will do that to you, so I can't blame her. The writing's pretty good on this one too, highlighting plenty of negatives about the characters, but just as many positives as well. The animation's pretty good too, with it very seamlessly transitioning between sprite animation and hand-drawn animation. I also love how, just like in One Punch Man, the episode's art style for Tatsumaki will just suddenly shift to one's original, terribly drawn art. But there are a few issues with it. I'm not too big of a fan of 100%. Once again, another song that's better as a backing track than a song on its own. There were actually quite a few of those in this season, sadly, and we're not even done with the songs that fill that category. And the finisher, I feel, kind of goes against what they were saying, while also still somehow agreeing with it. It's complicated, I know, but I think you get what I mean if you watch the full episode. Good episode, but it needs some polish. Comedy is a very subjective thing. I remember hearing from someone that comedy is the second most subjective topic out there behind only musical taste. So forgive me for having this episode be a little low.
Fuck you.
Indeed. Who's next?
I have mixed feelings about this episode. It's still good, but certain elements bug me, while others I feel are done really well. For one thing, I think on a conceptual level, this episode is great. If this is supposed to be Deadpool's final ever appearance in Death Battle, both in a fight and outside of it, I think it's a great send-off. And as an example of showing what happens when Death Battle actually does play favorites, like some people have said they do in certain episodes, myself included at times back on the old forums, I think this episode is great. Plus, credit to Swan on the writing of this episode because he did a fantastic job with it. The writing gets a solid A+ from me on those levels. It's just that everything else kinda drags it down. The voice acting's pretty good. Taka once again just kills it as Deadpool, and Kyle Agnexi, I'm pretty sure I pronounced that wrong, was pretty good as the Mask. The animation's very well drawn, though the mask looks a bit weird at times. I don't know how to describe it, but at times he looks like he was drawn really quickly to try and get things done faster. Also, while I give credit to Swan's writing, I don't know whether it's just the jokes or the voice acting, but I'm not keen on the comedy of this episode like I was with previous joke fights, like Hercule vs. Dan or even Goomba vs. Koopa. And of course, the music's another good backing track, but not good solo track. Don't get me wrong, I like this episode, and I'll rewatch it again, but I just feel like there are other episodes I'd probably rewatch first. You know, I thought for sure this episode was gonna end up a lot higher than what it did. I knew this episode was going to be a hit from the moment it was announced, even if the two episodes that came out before it were bad, and I was definitely right in that regard. It's a good example where both the writing and the animation really came together in a solid way. Things like the Waddle Dee and Goomba literally having their minds blown, even if the poor Waddle Dee looked kinda gross growing a mouth. The direct interactions Wario and Dedede have with each other, the little seductive Dedede pose at the end that's so good. Another Discord server I'm on from the one that I announced last week has dedicated themselves to putting it into every Death Battle, 1 Minute Melee, and DBX episode. Seriously, there are so many good moments to this episode, and Appetite for Greed's a great song to listen to, both in the fight and on its own. Really, the only reason this episode's not any higher is just that the next episodes are ones that I like better. While I was making this list, this episode just kept dropping and dropping, but it's a great episode and more than enough to sate your appetite. So, you guys ever hear of mood whiplash? It's what happens when a form of media goes from one extreme emotion, like happiness and pure joy, to another, like absolute sadness. Sometimes it's a bad thing, like when a series decides to make one entry bright and happy and colorful, but then they make the next entry dark and gritty. It's something that the internet will make fun of one day. But if you want an example of where it's done really well, look no further than this episode.
Shine! Go beyond! Ultra!
Good fight. Let's do it again.
This is an episode where some people were confused on why it was made the season finale, with some people speculating that it was solely because of All Might being here. But once the fight itself happened, everyone knew why they did it. This fight was just so much fun to watch, to the point that you end up forgetting, oh yeah, one of these people has to die. And then when both end up dying, yeah, that felt like the only way this could end, both in terms of accuracy and in terms of writing. The episode was great to watch, with Kaiji Tang once again giving us a great performance, this time as All Might. And whoever the anonymous voice actor for Might Guy was did a great job too. I'll admit, I didn't like them at first, but once the fight itself started to pick up, both really gave it their all. The animation's a bit weird at times, to the point that it can take you out of the fight for a bit, but it was still great for most of it and you didn't notice it as you watched the episode. And while I wasn't sold on it at first, Mighty is a great track. Still not my personal favorite of the season, but I can see why it is for other people. Who knew that teaming up Brandon Yates and Theirwolf Media together would make for such a great song? Really, while the little things kept this episode from being a truly fantastic episode for me, I can see why people would say otherwise. A great showing from two great teachers, inspiring us all to smile, even in the darkest of times. Hey, did you know that there's a fan blog that followed in the original research team's footsteps? They've been doing this since season 3, and I actually made some guest showings on there for 3 of their blogs before this season. Deadpool vs. Pinkie Pie, Sub-Zero vs. Glacius, and Raven vs. Twilight Sparkle. I only bring this up because I also made a guest appearance on 5 blogs they did this season. And funnily enough, all but one of the episodes from here on out are ones I made an appearance on. That includes this one.
Keep going, we've got this! Oh no! Pull back! Pull back!
Man, this episode made me sad. Not from anything with the actual quality of the episode. The episode itself was great. But I mean with how the result turned out. Well, I knew it wasn't going to happen. I was rooting for Dragonzord the whole time I was watching the episode. It still kinda stings just writing about this episode in the script. But I also absolutely enjoyed this episode even in spite of that. The episode was fantastically put together. The writing in this episode was fantastic, with a great number of jokes, badass lines, and real care put into making both robots seem as awesome as they are. Draconic Robotics is a great track, even if listening to it outside of the fight actually does kinda spoil you with how the fight's going to end. The voice acting is amazing, with Nicholas Andrew Louis sounding great as Tommy, but while he was great, Whoever's idea it was to cast Hitomi Farrell as Akane and have her actually speak Japanese deserves a bonus in their check, because she was absolutely amazing. And it would have been screwed up to either have voice clips for Akane or to have her voiced in English, which I don't think she ever was. The episode's animation is great too, and even got someone like me who knew Tommy was probably going to lose to actually think he might win. Both the Dragonzord and Kiryu were animated wonderfully. My only real issue is with the actual models. They feel off at times, even Tommy himself seeming very weird. It's a bit jarring, but you forget about it once the two are actually moving around and fighting. A fantastic episode, even if it still stings to talk about. Now, I normally don't fear too much about the order of my episodes, and I have absolutely no regrets about where I list my episodes when I do these things, even if time makes certain episodes rise or fall in ranking. That being said, if any episode is going to make me afraid about where I put it, it's this one. Move over Goku vs. Superman, because there's a new most controversial episode of the show.
Not the first doofus to try to take this. It's hero time.
Ew, I stepped in loser. Oh, it hurts to laugh. Don't ask.
If you're watching this, and the episode has a massive number of dislikes on it, I think you know why. Whoo! Boy, was this episode hated by so many people when it came out. I mean, just look at the like to dislike ratio on that video. Let me address this now. Yes, I think this episode is right. I even said as much in the fan blog. But even if I didn't think it was right, I would still say this episode deserves to be this high. The episode is just too good for it to not have that happen. First off, the animation is amazing. Hal looks great, as do Ben and his aliens, but the hand-drawn elements definitely have their time to shine in this episode. Each one only adds to the episode's quality, from the boxing match between Hal and Way Big, to Alien X's moments in hand-drawn animation making Hal look like a complete chump. Then there's the voice acting. Nicholas had a really big role to fill in this episode, having to voice not only Ben, but each and every one of his aliens that made an appearance. And it really showed off his vocal range too. As someone who does voice editing, I can tell you that every single voice he provides is completely natural. Bradley Gareth also does a really good job voicing Hal, with a great mix of confident badass and cocky asshole that pretty much is Hal Jordan. And Emerald Heroes, while a song I didn't initially care about, has quickly grown to become one of my favorites. Plus the writing just does such a great job of explaining both characters and making them feel perfect in this kind of situation. Fun fact, Swan wrote 5 episodes this season, and 4 of them are in the top 5 of the season, this one included. This episode, however, is another example where the episodes above it on the list are there because they had that little extra something to put them over the top. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go hide in a bunker in order to finish the recording. So, remember how I said that the bottom 2 entries on this list, it took me until the last minute to decide which went where? Well, I had the same problem with the top 4. Throughout this season, as it aired, I kept debating which of them was going to be in what order. And as each of these 4 came out, I had to keep readjusting my list. Needless to say, it was a very long and difficult process, but I figured it out soon enough. So, which is the worst of the best?
Holy fraggaroli. I definitely ain't picking up that bounty now.
Lobo of Zarnia, your sins are innumerable. I am here to wreak vengeance upon your soul. No.
I know there were a ton of people who wanted to see Ghost Rider vs. Spawn, but I feel like this episode was a much more fitting idea. And it was really the only Marvel vs. DC match I really wanted to see after Aquaman vs. Namor came out. And holy hell did they make this fight kick ass! No pun intended. The animation looked amazing, with a ton of awesome and kind of ridiculous moments in it that are just unforgettable. The voice acting was fantastic, with Stephen Kelly's transition from Ghost Rider to Zarathos being awesome, while Jason Marnocha did an unbelievable job as Lobo, sounding better than pretty much any other actor who played Lobo before him. And yes, I'm including both Brad Garrett and John DiMaggio on that list. Swan's writing was fantastic, with hilarious lines and great moments from both Wiz and Boomstick, and that finisher was just the best mix of creepy and awesome I've ever seen. So why is this only number 4? Well, there is one thing I do have an issue with. The music. You'd think I'd love Ride Into Hell, but I found it to just sound like a generic rock track without a real distinguishable melody. Still, watching and rewatching this episode really gets my motor running. Some of you might have been expecting this to be number 1. For a while, I thought it was too, but newer episodes came along and changed all that. Still, it's a big improvement over Mega Man's last appearance on this show. As a Mega Man fan, I absolutely love this episode. While 5 characters at once with such a vast amount of media seems like it would be hell on the poor research team, they proved their worth and made an episode that was absolutely amazing, on top of the awesome work Swan put into writing this. The animation, for pretty much having no dialogue, really was fantastic, with a ton of fan service and great moments from all 5 characters, including poor Volnut. Mega Mania is a badass song, and one I feel fits in with almost every one of the OSTs of this franchise. Seriously, if they had made a chiptune version of this, it would have made it even more fitting for Mega Man Classic. And the writing for Wiz and Boomstick was hilarious, and was one of the best moments about this episode, especially Boomstick's rant between the Volnut and EXC rundowns. Honestly, this is an episode that I didn't know I wanted, but I'm glad I got. But the next 2 just topped it in my opinion. Okay, I know some of you were expecting this to be number 1. One of you even commented saying you thought it would be either this or Dragonzord vs. Kiryu, but I'll explain my reasoning as to why it isn't later. All I can say is, this is a fight I was eager to see and so glad that I did.
You're right. You're not a man. You're a pig. Let me hear you squeal.
Let it never be said that Ben doesn't listen to the fans, because the fact that this episode even exists is a sign that he does, and the love that everyone seemed to put into it only made it as awesome of a fight as possible. I said this back in the Season 3 list that Ganondorf is my favorite villain in video games, and I think this episode is a fight he deserved to have. But let us not go unappreciative of Dracula being in this episode. Not only was he made out to be the absolute badass he is, but I think having him be the first Castlevania rep in Death Battle is fitting, especially more than if it were Simon Belmont as the first rep. This is the closest we ever got to a Death Battle holiday special, what with the episode essentially being a Halloween episode, and it was an episode where pretty much everyone was at their peak. Brandon Yates made a truly haunting but fantastic song in the form of The Dark Lords. Swan wrote Wiz and Boomstick to be hilarious while having Ganondorf and Dracula both be as badass as we know them to be. William Sopp took a character who didn't really have a proper voice outside of sound effects and made him sound like the awesome conquering warlock that Ganondorf is. And Stephen Kelly returning to voice Dracula was fantastic too, sounding perfect for Dracula, to the point that he gives Patrick Sykes or even Graham McTavish a run for their money. But if anyone deserves to get mad props for this episode, it's the animators. This is the first ever episode to be animated in Source Filmmaker, so Death Battle brought in several people who were skilled with SFM. Devil Artemis, Dai Tomodachi, Duvad Hodan, and David Fisher, all of whom I'm pretty sure I pronounced some of them wrong, and who all put in amazing work and just made this fight feel fantastic. It's not perfect, but rarely anything is. Like with last season, I came so close to putting this at number 1, but, well, only one fight could top it. While I was arguing with myself about which of the 4 episodes would be number 1, I knew that the top 2 was going to be the hardest. Ghost Rider vs. Lobo and the Mega Man Battle Royale fell into their spots pretty quickly, but these last 2 have been so close that even at the time of writing this, I'm still debating on which episode I think deserves this spot. But in the end, I think the winner of number 1 said it himself with just 5 simple words.
Only one can be worthy.
What do I even say about this episode? Like, these past 4 fights have all been so fantastic that trying to come up with new things to say without repeating myself is incredibly difficult. Even as I type these words down for the script, I'm basically stalling for time to try and come up with the words. The episode is just amazing. First, the writing of the episode. Ben did some amazing work with this script, and even then, he wasn't alone in writing it. From what I've gathered, members of the research team submitted in jokes for the episode, and a few of them even got used. And really, whoever submitted in those jokes, thank you for doing so, because you guys all did wonderfully. Next, the animation. The animation is easily the best 2D animation of the season, with it starting out slow, but ramping up as the fight went on until it went to insane badass levels. I loved watching this fight as it just kept increasing in badassery. I know that's not a word, just bear with me. The music, Falcon Uncaged, while not the best song this season, was a fantastic example of what kind of music Death Battle songs should be. Fun to listen to on their own, but complementing the animation to make it even better. The voice acting was hilarious, with Kieran Flitton's voice for Johnny Cage being a perfect example of how much of a lovable douchebag Johnny is, and Keston Howard doing a great job of Captain Falcon. Sure, he sounded kind of weird trying to mimic Ryo Horikawa's voice lines for Falcon from Smash, but that's a minor complaint, and he still did an awesome job. But what puts this over Ganondorf vs. Dracula, you may be asking? Well, it's 2 things. First, the finisher. Awesome as what Ganondorf vs. Dracula's finisher was, I think this episode's finisher is just better and more amazing. And second is that this episode, much like Balrog vs. TJ combo, was able to achieve the level of amazingness that it did without nearly as much hype as what Ganondorf vs. Dracula had, which, let's be honest, that was probably the most hyped matchup for the whole season. And so, because of all this, that's why Johnny Cage vs. Captain Falcon is my number 1 fight of Season 6. Man, these lists were fun to make, and while I had some problems with the YouTube version of the Season 5 list, I still had a lot of fun making them. And hey, I got them out before Season 7 starts. Speaking of which, when is that again? Sunday? Well, looks like I know what I'm doing next. I'll see you guys all soon enough.